Hey, we're back with XR at Work. Scott and Dane, glad to have you guys today. Good show today. Hope you take a minute, watch this all the way through, and like and subscribe to our podcast if you find this content valuable. Dane, introduce our guest today, if you would, sir.
Yeah, so today we have a distinguished guest, Tom Ffiske from the Immersive Wire. Tom is it the editor or the writer or both? Do you do it all? What do you do, Tom?
I do it all.
He does it all. Sounds good. Well, Tom, I think I was telling you before the podcast started. Immersive Wire is one of my favorite, uh, you know, I guess newsletters on the XR space, and so I really appreciate and I'm excited to have you on today. But if you want to start by giving us kind of a summary of what the things that you talk about in your newsletter, that'd be awesome.
Certainly. So it's a kind of a weekly briefing on what's happening in immersive tech and metaverse space. There's a lot of people who just don't have a lot of time in the mornings, and it's just a good way to just get a condensed view of what's going on and just make it as direct as possible. The crux of the work which I do is that I do think there's a lot of fluff out there. I think there's a lot of overinflated values and different perspectives when it comes to it. And my role is to try and put some sense into it. Subsidiary roles, there's a lot of smaller companies doing some incredible work, and my role is to share their new news as it comes. So it just spreads a little bit further. This is news that has been going on since 2020, it's now 2023. And yeah, I'm delighted to talk with you all and just share my views and have a discussion, I hope, on all the things we've all been seeing.
Yeah, no, agreed. Well, so you kind of led into this, so I'm gonna jump right in. You mentioned inflated values and some of the hype that's going on in the space, and all these different things. How do you differentiate what's going to be really valuable to people right in the space versus like the hype and the investor money and all those different things when you're thinking about writing your newsletter?
I do tend to find that I receive press releases, and what I do is I just kind of scrutinize the press release to see what's substantive. No, if I'm honest, the barrier of entry is not very high. It's really, was this announced within the last week, and is this relevant to metaverse, VR, and AR? There are some companies that just don't who don't match that. For example, I do have companies sometimes who remove the dates of their press releases and try to send me news that is older than a week, which is very sneaky of them, unfortunately. and I do have companies who say, "Oh yeah, Tom is really relevant. This is about like artificial intelligence," which can be relevant, but not if it's just purely just AI. It needs to tie into a spatial or immersive tech context. So there's some scrutiny, but ultimately the goal of my newsletter is to like try and share some good quality information and to help profile smaller players to make sure they can help grow. And that's a goal which I have.
That's awesome. Go ahead, Scott.
Tom, so when we look at consumer XR versus enterprise XR, right, and kind of those two worlds, do you have a bent towards one or the other? Kind of what are your thoughts there? Do you try and keep a mix? Obviously, Dane and I live in an enterprise XR space, as does our audience. But I mean, kind of what's your thoughts on that, and how do you approach those two worlds when you're curating your newsletter?
I do both virtual and augmented reality, and I do within reason flex of Web3 and blockchain. And also, it doesn't even need to be with immersive tech. It can be a metaverse platform which you can access as well. The input doesn't really matter to me. It's more the wider context of the focus on spatial technologies as a whole, which I appreciate is pretty vague and pretty wide, but it's one which is quite tech agnostic. I didn't want to name my website to be just like I'm pulling out myself like something on VR focus or upload VR. The input is not the point. The point is the fact that we're entering a phase where it's more spatial with the internet and how we're be more embodied when it comes to communications and technologies. And the core of the immersive wire is to profile that and look into that, which is why it within that remit I cover those what you mentioned in detail.
Gotcha. So in some cases, like the consumer industry leads the industrial industry, and then vice versa. Do you think that consumer drives XR technologies right now, or do you think enterprise drives XR technologies?
I have the impression that enterprise is leading to great revenue generation, and history has always shown us that innovations in enterprise or business then seep down into consumer. So, and in terms of activity and profitability as well, that enterprise focus is very much a money driver for a lot of organizations. I know PwC is one example of that. I know HTC is another example of that as well. So, yeah, I do think it's more focused on enterprise based on what I've seen.
That's awesome.
So, and I actually agree. I think you're spot on, Tom. I mean, I think that enterprise has the money. Enterprise can buy hundreds or thousands of headsets. They can buy software larger chop. They're going to lead with some innovation in the industry. But I think consumer gets a lot of press, right? Because it's sexy and it's public stuff and it's accessible by more people out there. I mean, certainly there's some interest on the consumer side. And do you agree? Do you feel like consumer gets a lot more press because it's just sexier, more public stuff than what's happening in factories and oil and gas?
Depends what weekday of the week it is. I do see. Well, I do see publications like The Economist covering the enterprise side sometimes. I see the Time magazine do it, as well as consumer as well. For in terms of market consciousness and perception, wider perception, those consumer innovations are vital, and that does then shape how the wider world sees immersive technologies as well. So, if, for example, there's a big movie like Ready Player One that comes out, the way people see virtual reality in the future is going to be shaped inevitably by a release of a big consumer movie. But I think we on this call are smart enough and knowledgeable enough to know that the real innovation comes down to that business side, which then leaks down into consumer, which was we're ahead of the curve in that way. It's a question of just being aware that public perceptions is very much based on those consumer type applications.
Great point. Yeah.
Do you feel like I love Ready Player One as a movie. I think it's a great movie, from an entertainment perspective, but it's also challenging for people that are in Scott and I's role because we end up having to live up to really high expectations because without the CGI and everything that makes that movie great. So, like, what's your perspective on kind of where we're at in the hype cycle right now for these types of technologies?
Drop of disillusionment, I think, will be where we are in the Gartner hype cycle. We're just kind of surfing down that, and then we might go up the slope of enlightenment. Maybe later this year. I'm hoping so, anyway. And the reason why is perception. I mentioned the consumer perception, and it's astonishing how cynical some countries are when it comes to the metaverse. The UK, where I'm based, is particularly cynical when it comes to immersive technologies. There was a study that came out from a law group which explored that, and it was a shame that it happened. And what the crux of it also is, I'm compare that to China, where China is actually quite well supported too. In terms of hype cycle, I think we're hitting like a little lower point, but hopefully we'll be able to go up from there.
That's interesting. So, like, I think about this quite a bit. Actually, is what's the like cultural ramification, of XR? Like, so for instance, like if the UK is highly restrictive on the metaverse, and China, adopts it wholeheartedly and pushes innovation forward. Do you think that there's like a risk of kind of falling behind, in the UK or in other countries that aren't adopting? And like I think about like what does that turn into, over time?
It might lead to a lack of adoption. It depends what kind you're talking about. Are you talking about more consumer-based applications, more enterprise-based? Is there a particular area you want to focus on with that question?
Well, I mean, I think consumer, just from a cultural level, is probably most applicable, here. But like, for instance, if China starts doing parts of their schooling in VR, and they're able to teach people concepts faster, for instance, versus other places in the world, like, does this become a differentiator for countries that are really leaning in to the technology?
On the cultural level, I can see that. I can see there's an element of perception that'll lead to adoption if it is intangible and difficult to track.
Hmm.
And yes, I can see it leading to an impact. More fundamentally, though, the more consumer you go, the more price elastic it becomes. I've seen plenty of indications that when it comes to virtual reality, quality doesn't matter as much. It's just price. So much so that when there was the year in the UK where the Oculus Quest came out, I think it was Oculus Go, even though the Quest is the better headset, the Oculus Go outsold it purely because it was so much cheaper compared to the Quest. And I believe that that's going to consistently be the case with these VR headsets. I know Pico's trying to make it as cheap as possible. Meta did make it as cheap as possible before the price increase, followed by the price decrease, which happened last week, if I remember it. It wasn't that much of a price decrease. It was like $40, if I remember right. And then, yeah, and I do think that these little input devices are price elastic, which is important to keep track of.
It's interesting. I like F1, right? And so I kind of think about enterprise as like the F1 of VR, where all the development happens and you get new features, and there's kind of a push forward, and it can be expensive, right? Because the enterprise customers can absorb the cost. But then you get into like the Toyota Camry, which is the consumer market, right? And over time they start to adopt these features that happen in the more expensive headsets, but it kind of cascades down to your point earlier on where things start. So like I was thinking about Vario, right? Vario is a great example where they've had very good graphics for a long time, and now you're starting to see high graphics quality and stuff in the Quest Pro and other things. So it's kind of a test bed in enterprise, I think, sometimes.
I do think so, and it's great to see these innovations come through when it comes to that too. I do want to go back to you on the previous questions which we've been asking so far, though, because you do. This is a podcast which is focused on XR work, but though so far there's been a focus on that consumer aspect. I'm curious about this bridge you have in your minds. So how do you bridge between that consumer aspect and the work when it comes to immersive technologies?
I'll take it, and then I'll hand it to Scott.
Go ahead, man.
One of the challenges that we face right now is that there's a distinct separation between consumer and enterprise. So, for instance, I would love to be able to buy a ton of enterprise quests, for instance, and be able to deploy those. And I know Oculus for Enterprise just came out recently and all that stuff. The problem is the way that they're modeling that is more similar to a consumer market, where it's like a one-to-one. You buy one headset and one person uses it at their desk or whatever. The problem is in manufacturing, that's not how users interact with devices. You have shared devices, right, that lots of different people use for training. And so there's kind of a fundamental mismatch because there's one business model for both consumer and enterprise. And so I think companies are going to have to get more sophisticated over time in the way that they're thinking about the device. But that's a big challenge for us right now because from a legal perspective, like we can't have a shared account across multiple people, and that's the only way to be able to do more than kind of a one-to-one type of deployment. Particularly with Meta. Now, I think Pico, you mentioned Pico earlier. I think Pico has a much better strategy from the enterprise perspective on that because it's not as kind of closed off as the Oculus ecosystem. But I think that's a big challenge that we're going to have. And fundamentally, the companies that are making VR headsets, for instance, are generally kind of content and social media businesses. They're not traditional manufacturing businesses, at least if you look at the ones who have sold the most, devices. And so I think that's a big challenge that, Scott and I face in the space currently. Would you agree, Scott?
Yeah, totally. We deal with a lot of things in enterprise that they don't have to worry about on the consumer side, right? An Oculus Quest in my house on home Wi-Fi in a controlled environment with light and ambient noise and that sort of thing. Consumer accounts, for content, that sort of thing. Totally different on the enterprise side. There's a big gap there. That's why Dane and I. Well, Dane makes a lot of money. I make a little bit, right? Because there's a lot to deal with. You bet. Does that answer your question, Tom?
That does answer my question,
Yeah.
and it's a curious bridge to pull. It does sound. I'm feeling a malaise of sorts from the two of you as well, in a sense. So
Why is that?
Well, in the malaise in that you are aware of the importance of that consumer aspect, and the questions in your answer implies a level of cynicism. Am I right about that?
I think we're both a little jaded, probably, to be honest with you. I mean, I think Scott and I have both been in the space around the same amount of time, 5 or 6 years. And so we've had the opportunity to grow up with some of the original, I guess, kind of modern headsets. And we've seen all the problems, right? The thing for us, or at least for me, I have a lot of hope, in this space.
Mhm.
Like I really think that the technology itself has the opportunity to have a massive impact on how people learn and, businesses and all those things. And so for me, it's like I'm holding out hope, but there is malaise just because, uh, we've hit the walls, several times.
We're a little beat down by internal security and device management and attorneys and that sort of thing. We make a lot of times consumer solutions work in enterprise. Because we have to, because we're supporting factory workers, frontline workers. But it's a cross that we bear gladly. I mean, it's listen, putting extended reality solutions and tools into industrial environments. It's what Dan and I both love, and we do in our day jobs, and it's a great way to make a living.
I
We
understand.
probably overcome so many obstacles at this point that we don't even really kind of see them as obstacles necessarily all the time, because it's just part of what we do. But the end result is worth it. Making factories more efficient, more productive, keeping workers safer. It's a great calling. You bet.
I agree, and it's good to go through that process as well and to evolve.
Yeah.
So Tom, I'm looking at your newsletter right now over here on my other screen. I have it pulled up, so I'm boosting your open rate today.
Give him some click throughs, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So tell me about some things that are going on right now that are exciting to you.
So what's exciting? Not necessarily exciting, but just a little bugbear which I have at the moment is there are lots of reports coming out at the moment trying to evaluate the worth of the market. So Bloomberg Intelligence report, for example, the metaverse will be worth 615 billion by 2030. McKinsey said it'll be worth 15 trillion by 2030. Frost and Sullivan said it'll be worth 720 billion by 2030. The range is quite wide across all of these organizations. The bugbear I have is these companies trying to pin a number on it, and I don't trust the number a lot of the time. It's being valued between billions and trillions, and it's very unclear on how it could be valued so high or so comparatively low.
Mhm.
The crux of why is I suspect is because it's going to unlock new types of jobs and roles, which I will unlock new types of value, but are difficult to track because they don't exist yet. I don't think anyone could have predicted that YouTubers would be big, for example, or TikTokers. or JPEGs and monkeys being worth more than houses. I think there's an element of that, and I think that's seeping into these under inflated expectations and statistics when it comes to the new sector.
Do you also think it's because metaverse is such a, like, the definition is so opaque, that it could be anything under the sun, or it could be a very specific subset of that?
I do think so, and I think it bleeds into studies into it not doing as well as they should do. So, for example, Razorfish did a study on how the metaverse is seen, and you could tell with the survey results that it just assumed that the metaverse was gaming. So it said, "Oh, the metaverse seen really positively," and I think, "Wow, people love to game in the metaverse." But because they went into the survey defining it as such, it therefore skewed the results of said data and how people saw it. That's a common problem, and I don't see a useful answer until we've got a clear and globally cohesive view of what the metaverse is, which does not exist.
What does metaverse mean to you, Tom? That's a dangerous question, right?
I think the metaverse is the friends we make along the way. No, it is. I think it is. I see it as the evolution of the internet, so it becomes more spatial, and there's more basically a greater embodiment of the self when it comes to the internet and immersive technologies. That's a personal view. That's capturing in the widest way possible based on what I've seen. I'm sure there are lots of other organizations with differing opinions. If I want to wear a different hat, there will be a differing opinion, which is very close to that, which I agree with too. But the crux of it is, I just think people are just going to become more and more immersed in what they do online. And I think whatever form that takes doesn't matter. I think it's an inevitability of the way we are connecting together.
That's awesome.
So we certainly encourage everyone to come to, immersivewire.com and sign up for your newsletter. I mean, is it poor form of us to ask you, like, where are you getting news from? Is there anywhere that you would recommend without kind of giving away your secrets or pushing traffic to another outpost? I mean, anything, what do you like?
I mean, not at all. Like, please support the people I'm about to say as well. This industry is far too small to just say follow just one person. Follow everyone you wish, and talk to everyone and help everyone grow. We're too small to not do that. I do really like Inside. Inside does Inside Metaverse. That's pretty good for like daily snippets with a little bit of analysis. Organics does enterprise kind of immersive stuff, which is pretty good if you want to focus on that. For XR at work, I believe that'll probably work really well for you guys, because Organics really hits the nail on the head for the kind of work that you do.
How do you spell that?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect.
Listeners, it is AUGANIX, I believe.
Glad I asked, because I wouldn't have known. That's awesome. I'll have to check that out.
And what else do I follow? I do get press releases, so I do tend to scrape through those press releases and see what I can add to the newsletter from there as well. I know it sounds basic, but yes, I do Google Metaverse, but I don't. It's very particular in the way I do it, just so I can get some relevant things. And last, I do use Twitter and LinkedIn, but both of them can be cesspits, so I'm quite careful about what I use as well.
Hey, wait, we're on LinkedIn. Okay, so
I'm on LinkedIn as well. I think you know me enough to know that I post on LinkedIn almost every work day. I'm not dismissing the power of the platform nor its importance, but I can, within the same breath, also say that it's not the best platform and it can be quite toxic, which I'm self-aware about.
Yeah.
So I have a background in permission-based email marketing, Tom, as well, and I know you. I think are your open rates public knowledge? I mean, you mentioned one in the pre-show, but you enjoy a pretty good open rate, right? And I imagine you probably have pretty good click rates if you're tracking that as well. Why do you think that is?
I don't mind being open about this sort of stuff. At the moment, I've got an open rate about 48%, and my click rate is looking about 12% at the moment. There is You've got email marketing brain, so I feel like what I'm about to say wouldn't be a surprise to you, but your listeners might find interesting. Newsletters are boring in that no one would broadcast and just shout about how, wow, this email I receive is like the best thing in the world. But
Except me.
but I will say that newsletters do serve a function of being useful if done right. The crux of my newsletter, and I believe of why it's consistently got good open rate and click rate, is that it is consistent. It's posted once per week throughout the year, except when I go on holidays, but I advertise that quite heavily. And I try to make it so that when people open the email, as much as I can, I try to put what's important literally in the first screen that appears when they open it. I don't do a preamble at the beginning, wasting people's time. I don't add like pictures too much as I can. I literally want to show them what the headlines are, what the stat of the week is, what the conversation starter is. And just so that like it just hits them with the value immediately. And then if people want to go a little bit further, they keep scrolling down if they wish. The newsletter is designed for people who are poor on time. I just want to make it as easy as possible.
So do you have, and I'm interested in this, I mean, do you have sponsorships available for your email list? Will you rent your list? Will you do in-email paid sponsorships? Are you monetizing it?
I don't monetize it at the moment. The Nate speaks to the writer in me that like within reason, I like writing to be free. Within the newsletter at least. I used to do sponsors. So I used to do promotions. Igloo Vision was actually one of the longest standing ones.
Mm-hmm.
I do find the function of a newsletter is better for a newer company to build a presence and awareness rather than directly click through to sales. I tend to find that when people read a newsletter, they don't open it with the search intention of being, oh, I saw this service and now I'm going to buy it. They open it with the search intention in my side of becoming better aware of the market and being better aware of the companies, which is why a better function of my newsletter is for building brand awareness.
Terrific. Yeah, we've struggled. We've not struggled with this a little bit, but XR at Work, we have no sponsors. We take no money. We do this all on our own to further the XR community on the enterprise side, and so it's good to hear that you're not hawking your stuff for the highest bidder, that sort of thing. It's good to hear. So we certainly want to encourage everyone to support Immersive Wire and sign up for the newsletter. You bet.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Yep. No, and I think it comes across authentically too, Tom. So like, I think that's one of the things that's most interesting to me about your newsletter is when it ends up in my inbox, I don't feel like I'm like I'm going to read an ad, right? I feel like I'm going to read real information that pertains to, the things that I care about. So I appreciate that you do that. Speaking of your newsletter, like I said, I have it pulled up here. And one of the things that the second bullet for this week is Meta has sold nearly 20 million Quest headsets to date. So, a lot of times, like companies and investors and all that stuff say, 10 million is like the network effect number, right? That you have to get to in order to hit scale or the social zeitgeist. Like, why do you think that after selling twice that many, it hasn't quite hit that escape velocity?
No, I remember that quote which Zuckerberg said. More accurately, he said it's not about scale. He said that when it hits around 10 million, that's when they suspect it'll become a self-sustaining ecosystem when it comes to content. Up to 10 million, it was very much Meta. I'm being crass, throwing a lot of money into it in order to grow it further. And then once it hits 10 million, then becomes an ecosystem which is more self-sustaining and can keep going. I would argue that we hit that stage where if you do develop content for Quest or Quest 2 at least, then you are entering a system where you will be better supported so long as your content is good. What's the bigger question I have now is what's plans that are to keep growing to be a little bit wider, a little bit deeper. So Meta will release a slightly more expensive VR headset this year, which is the Quest 3, quote unquote. I'm personally more interested in the headset the year after, which is said to be the much cheaper version. And I have a strong suspicion that this cheaper version is going to see greater pickup, which is why I want to keep an eye on that one.
That's interesting. I know. I read that article with Zuckerberg, recently, and I think it was Boz. Was it Boz? The guy that their CTO was mentioning that their intention was to increase their intention was to increase in retention of consumers. What do you think's driving the fact that people are buying Quests and not going back to them, or not using them as often as Meta might have wanted people to?
Yeah, I saw that comment as well. It's really interesting. The Verge article indicated that people are buying it for Christmas and then use it and then just don't pick it up again, which is really interesting statistic. I also believe that's why there are companies which are more focusing on types of services and activities that are more recurring. So fitness is a good example of that. I think fitness has proven to be one of the strongest selling points of VR, and also one of the more financially lucrative areas, because you then have to put on a headset relatively regularly in order to stay fit, which is good for recurring payments, which helps companies grow and obviously helps Meta as well, which is why there may well be a deeper focus on that. Similarly, I do think that there I read another piece which is actually supports your point. It's beyond Quest, but I think it's important to say. PC VR is struggling in the moment, not least because of the number of different types of headsets, but also because there's a weird sale culture with Steam where people don't tend to buy unless it's a sale, which developers themselves are seeing, and that impacts the way in which a company can grow. Because if they have peaks of sales during the launch or sales periods, then obviously it's not as predictable.
Right. Wow. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, that's one thing about consumer versus enterprise as well, is that consumer is very cyclical, right? Like,
Yes.
around December, you're going to sell a ton of headsets, and like you may not sell as much for the rest of the year. I think for enterprise, there's lots of opportunity to have a consistent income stream over time, because it's not as cyclical. One thing that's interesting too, Tom, that I don't know the answer to this, just more of an interesting thing that we're dealing with right now, is because the technology cycles so fast. We're trying to understand, like, how do we deal with all these leftover headsets, that we have over time. So that's an interesting thing to see, like how the secondhand market, shifts.
Yeah, I do wonder about that kind of stuff, because I think it is crass to compare Meta or Pico or HTC to Sony and Microsoft, because I don't think there are some parallels, but not all of them are strong. I do think there's an element of, are you releasing too many headsets at the same time? PlayStation, there'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 within 5 to 7 to 8 year increments. Quest, you don't know what the increments are. You don't know when you need to upgrade to the next one. And I think it causes an element of confusion and perhaps burn when basically when you buy one headset and then it might be irrelevant a few years later. It's a difficult one.
It reminds me a lot of like cell phones early on, right? Like you'd buy a cell phone with like the newest chip or whatever, and then the next week the next newest phone comes out, and your new phone is now old. and I think we're kind of at that same space, from a VR development or a VR hardware perspective.
Completely agree, and I think we're seeing elements of that. That's not to say Meta's strategy is incorrect. I think clearly it is working. I mean, they sold 20 million headsets. That's incredible. I just wonder what the continued long run ramifications is for a strategy like that.
So, sorry, Scott, I'm asking lots of questions, but I'm excited here.
It's all right.
Tom, given that you do your newsletter and all that stuff, the kind of ad business is interesting. What is, like, are there things that scare you about the concepts of running ads in the metaverse? Like, I'm concerned about this from an XR perspective, because I don't want to walk around and like they show the AR examples of what the future could look like, and there's like ads popping up, and there's all this kind of visible noise going on. What do you think about advertising, in the metaverse?
There's a guy who I know called Zesty who runs a little API for running ads, quote unquote, in the metaverse. He's a really nice guy. It's not algorithmic per se. It goes down to billboards, basically, in certain types of apps. But it's so difficult because it's not going to be necessarily just flashing billboards or AR things around the world. It's not going to be as crass as that. It's not going to be like in your face.
Mm-hmm.
If it's going to be anything, it's going to be using your data in order to create tailored kind of experiences or tailored recommendations, which then funnel you through as well. Got to be honest, since the metaverse, quote unquote, has not hit the scale it requires to grow, I think it's somewhat too early to discuss what these ad models are going to look like. I have strong suspicions one way or another, but I think we're just a bit too early to have these discussions.
Mm-hmm.
My only advice to companies at this current stage is to just respect the user as much as possible, both the data which they provide in your hands, as well as building firm groundwork to build the metaverse ahead as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think companies have a huge opportunity, at some point, right? Like when it actually does get to a point where it makes sense to run ads and things like that. I think my hope is that the ads are contextualized to, the user, and that they actually it's helpful. I think a lot of times like the traditional ad system is just like blast us and make sure people see it. It's all about eyeballs. And it feels like the new model is going to be like the ad is actually beneficial to the user because it's contextualized in the environment that they're in.
I completely agree. And I think it's that contextualization which is vital.
Mm-hmm.
I think we got a lot of good stuff on the horizon, and it harkens me back to the mid-90s with the internet when I first started building websites. It's like the hype cycles are just nuts, and people are trying to figure out how to make money off of it and all different kind of stuff. It's an exciting time, but I'm looking forward to it settling down a little bit. Yeah. Well, Tom, we want to thank you for being on the show today. We want to tell you how much we appreciate what you're doing in the industry, how you're helping out, getting good information out there, not boring your audience with a bunch of ads or unnecessary commentary, but you certainly have great perspective, and we appreciate what you're doing for the community, sir.
That's very kind of you. And likewise with you and your podcast as well. You're profiling people and to look deep into the XR space. And judging by the discussion we had before this call, you clearly have a goal to ensure it provides good quality and good insights on a perhaps more neutral basis, which is vital. And I hope that it's something which continues to gain pickup, because I think it's important to do.
Well, thank you. We want to encourage everyone to like and subscribe. If you like this content, you can find XR at Work on Spotify now, on YouTube, Apple Podcasts. Stay tuned for some more podcasts coming out soon. We appreciate everyone's time today. Tom, thank you from Dane and I both. We appreciate you, sir.
No worries at all. And I hope everyone on the call and beyond has a lovely day.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.